So this presentation is actually in two parts. I'm doing a piece on the book itself and some of the subjects of the book. And then I'll do a piece on my own sort of research in the last few years, looking at some of the environments around here, trying to figure things out about how what the environments were like in the past and how they've been changed by sediment and colonization. And so I'll get to that in a minute. But back to the book. So the chapters kind of lay out like this. For whatever reason, and I just discovered this, a few months ago, I didn't put numbers on the chapters. So if you happen to say chapter 4 or 5 to me, I don't know what you're talking about. There's no numbers on my chapters. There's this title. It's one of those little mistakes that presses make at times. So I think in version 2 will probably have numbers so that we can actually look at it 2 different ways. But it lays out very historically. I'll go over some of the subjects over and over again from different perspectives. Sometimes look at it from environmental perspectives, sometimes, from ethnography or culture or trees or removal or epidemiology, various ways. And sometimes, so it's important to say those kind of things because every time something happened, it affected people in different ways and in different areas of study. So I've gone into the things sometimes over and over again, looking at stories, trying to bring out as much as I can the perspectives and experiences of Native people in the valley and their being moved. And I look mostly at the Kalapuyans, Malala, Clackamas peoples, because those are the peoples in the Jones Valley. I had a whole lot of stories about them, so I helped. And so one thing about this is I have a blog called Cortex Journal, which I began working on really good about 10 years ago. And I produce now, I think I'm over 500 essays on the blog. Not all of it is about the Lake Valley. But I did notice some years ago that I had a huge concentration of articles about the valley, about the tribes in the valley. So I decided to bring those articles together into chapters for the book. And that's kind of the process. So those essays online today are really the first draft of chapters for the book. So if you want to see that progress, you can go right on there and read it for free. There's no paywall or anything. And that's helpful. Plus, there's probably another 300 essays on there about other tribes in Oregon, people from the Umpqua Valley, from the River Valley, from the coast, from Columbia, some stuff from Northern California and even Washington State. So I do have quite a bit on there that you can actually read for numerous days without getting through it all. So there's a lot of stuff there. So hopefully you get on there, get interested. It's actually pretty easily to find, found online. It's called the Cortex Journal. Pick up my name and it'll just appear. I really deal with Bolton from the colonization era. And then I follow, one of the few things I do that most people don't, most historians don't, is I follow the tribes onto the reservation and I kind of record what happened to them, what their experiences were at the Grand Ronde Reservation, mainly. Because that is a pretty grim story in itself. All right, let's move on. So why I wrote this? Well, I really wanted to tell stories of my people, which are not really well represented in history books. Maybe you guys have heard that, felt that, know that the state legislature passed a bill some 10 years ago, SB 13, to write curriculum for Oregon schools. By and large, that bill is not yet being taught in Oregon schools. I think a few districts I've heard that Palomas is doing it.
St. Paul got it.
St. Paul has it. So there are some districts that are, above the fold, but really, right now, most districts are kind of saying, well, COVID is a problem, so we don't want to spend money on that stuff. And part of the problem is, and I believe really is the situation, is there was no money attached to SB 13, so they didn't do any training of people. There was no plan for that. They had to find other sources of money to do some training. And I know the state, the employment, the education division had to do trainings. They did a few, and they didn't really do a complete training. They did a training of a few people for each district. So I guess they expected everybody to go back and infect everybody else with that training. That didn't really work. Doesn't really work like that in schools. Just don't have time to just go randomly teach other people how to teach the curriculum. So the problem is, I think that we need to develop a better system of education in Oregon, where we say to teachers that are people who want to be teachers, at least, to go take an ethnic studies course, or take a native studies course when they're in college, they're in their teaching, their teaching degree studies, and then they get some experience in that, so they know how to talk about native studies, ethnic studies, when they actually have to get to the classroom and do it. Because right now, that's not a requirement. They do it on their own. So someday I'm gonna try to influence that policy on their own. But really the problem is, as you know, every generation of Oregonians now has been through school. Nobody's really got native education in the classroom very well, unless you have a rare school district that had really good teacher that really went into it. That's a personal point of personal pride. But I find 99% of people didn't get it, and then I get all of your kids and grandkids. You have grandkids, and they don't have it either. So it's a really big problem. And this is not just Oregon; this is a national problem. So I thought that maybe we should be deserving represented in history books. And if I see that as a problem, and I can't expect everybody else around me to do it. So by saying that, I have to do it myself. So I wrote a book, did a lot of studies, wrote some books, wrote some articles. And I hope that does get picked up by schools as curriculum, as source material, and that'd be great. In most history books, they also don't have much native perspective in them. Native perspective meaning asking native people what they experienced in their history. And historians don't necessarily do that. I mean, I'm an anthropologist, so we're better if we don't do that. But historians, that's not part of what they do. They create history, they curate their own histories out of their own knowledge, what they read. They don't necessarily have to ask people about the history in order to write it. So, and that's maybe somewhat changing nowadays as historians have realized that they need to talk to people about history, and this notion of multi-local and intersectionality has come in, and people say, wait a minute, maybe we should be talking to these people about what they experienced in their history. All kinds of people, not just natives, but Latinos and blacks and women and other people, about what happened in their history, because we haven't done that. So that's hopefully a need that my book fulfills at some level. And then I also when I handed the manuscript to the press, they said, well, this is kind of boring, so let's add more stuff to it. And they had me write these little essays about my personal experiences encountering these histories for the first time. And sometimes, because the history relates to like things that I'm doing, like where I'm at, where am I doing that research, and my experiences in various landscapes. And so, like, for example, I didn't know anything about Crooked River Prairie back in the day before I started research on it, like 6-7 years ago. And you guys know, like, Crooked River Prairie is, do you know who it's named after? This Malala chief. Exactly. So there you go. So I didn't know all this stuff. I didn't know anything about Crooked River Prairie. I started doing this research. It turned out this guy was pretty amazing. He had been in the 1851 treaties negotiations, and he was like telling him you want all this money up front. He's like, I'm not going to survive any much longer, so you better give all the money now. And they're saying, no, we can't do that. And so he was really advocating for his people to get paid right now for their land. And he's one of the few in West Oregon that were doing this at the time. He didn't live until 1855 when people began to get paid. So he was right. He had some weird habits, but he actually got shot in, I think, Wilsonville, for entering a settler house and making the women cook for him, which I don't think is a euphemism for something else. But so that he actually did this. There's like stories that he did, going into people's houses and making the women cook for him, and the men are gone. And he was threatened to be shot next time that happened. So he was shot. So so this guy turns out to be an amazing, sort of weird hero, culture hero, really, for tribal people. When you start looking at what he was doing, and that's all Crooked Finger Prairie. That his tribe was there. They had land there. There was a meeting place up there for all the Malalas. We have stories of him being involved in the Abaquah battles over here. So that I didn't know that before, and that's not something that was part of our knowledge at Grand Ronde. So these are the kind of things that we're finding when we're doing this research. Just amazing stuff. Some of it is in old stories that were printed in slippers. that are really out of print. Nobody has access to that anymore. Nobody knows what that means. And so I'm finding this stuff and putting it in the book, cool. So I think he's in there, he's in there. So I also want to be very accurate, as much as accurate as we can historically. I know in the past that historians and others that wrote history didn't have access to all the documents we have today, they didn't have online access, didn't have digital archives. So having those sort of benefits nowadays really helps us. We don't have to travel to DC, we don't have to travel to Washington or wherever to access these archives. We can actually get much of it online. And even federal microfilm reels are now all online. You can look at all online. I don't have to go to U of O or up to PSU or wherever to get those microfilm reels. I can go online in my house. So that helps us sort of get more accurate histories nowadays, more detailed history, with more details we can add to those histories. In the past, there's been a lot of historians that have written stuff. I don't know if they just couldn't find records or what, but they really got a few things wrong, or just not quite accurate. Sometimes dates are wrong, things like that. And so I'm kind of a stickler for, as best I can be, for dates and times and what exactly happened, not making trying not to make the story as much as possible. Just because I think it may have happened. So that's what I'm doing. Trying to get accurate. So one of the things I try to do is, I've been doing for a long time for talks, doing talks for 20-something years now, is dispelling a lot of the mythologies around Native peoples. People have come to me over the past and said, well, if it wasn't for those smallpox blankets, we would have more people here today. And there is no actual record of smallpox blankets being handed out in the Northwest. That's again, those urban legends of people that haven't really, they don't really know. I mean, they're never taught or never got the right book, or were taught to relatives and that's what they said, or whatever. They never really had information. And so I've actually gone and talked and said this a number of times, and I've heard he does some research on smallpox blankets and figured out that, well, there were cases of this happening perhaps 4 centuries ago on the East Coast. There is perhaps a case that happened with the Blackfeet, 150 years ago or so, but nothing in Oregon. And so we do find that, like say here, the history of malaria is probably more prominent here. There's a big book by Robert Boyd about, malaria coming into the Northwest in around 1830, and then basically wiping out some 95 and 97% of some tribes. So that's a huge pandemic level event that happened in a very short period of time. It looks like extermination, but really was probably an accident. Nobody realized at the time, or if they did, they didn't write it down, that if they went to the tropics, they would get malaria, and the seals here would pick up that malaria and pass it around the population. Here, killing off a whole bunch of people. Maybe they did. Maybe somebody knew that, and right now, as far as we can tell, nobody actually wrote down that they knew that was going to be the case. We do have some questions about why people were not given quinine. It's not necessarily a cure. It's kind of cure malaria. The problem was that they didn't have a lot of doses of quinine. It was all reserved at Fort Vancouver, and it was only for the white population, really. And nobody thought they could actually help or could help the Native people. They're going through their death. And I did find that one settler, I think it was Samuel Parker, who came through. He showed them they could make that out of dogwood. But it was way too late for them to really get any kind of benefit from that. So, and he was only showing like the Clackamas tribe. So anyway, so that's a lot of like small detail you probably don't care about, but that's important to know when we start talking about diseases and stuff, what's happening. It's really important, I think, for me at least, kind of a nerd about history, to really know that those details about what was happening at the time and what was possible, not possible, and what is the truth like? I don't accept when people say, well, they intentionally pass these diseases around. I don't know that's the case. You know, not those, some other diseases possibly, but not those. It doesn't mean that we didn't have smallpox here, we did. There was probably a smallpox epidemic around the 1770s. There was another epidemic in the 1850s. But by that time, people had some immunity. It also, we also can't generalize about that was happening in the valley. It's the same thing happening on the coast, happening in Southern Oregon. Every place is a different environment with different dangers for those environments. The Rogue Rivers had less interaction with non-native people, whites coming through their territory. Kalapuyans had a lot more interaction with the settlers, actually helped them with their farms at times, and were around them quite a bit, tried learning the skills that were brought to the Willamette Valley, learning to be farmers, learning to be, you know, work with domesticated animals, things like that. And so they were around quite a few settlers in and around Rich Prairie and Walton area for several years, for a decade and a half. And so they were exposed early on to a lot of diseases that the rural people were not, because they were way out in the mountains, kind of distantly. They only had a few raiders running through their lands, trying to escape them. And they were not necessarily exposed to diseases. So those are a little more detail about that than maybe you really care about, but yeah, I think it's important for understanding some of the dynamics and the relationships between tribes and settlers. One thing I look at, I began going into again about 5-6 years ago, is this issue of environmental histories. Trying to understand what the environmental land is like, and trying to understand this notion of settler colonization. Have you guys heard of that before, settler colonization? So these issues that we're talking about were, I think, devised some 15 years ago or so. People were realizing that a lot of the problems that we had that were part of the original colonization of this land didn't really go away. They kind of are still here in many ways. They manifest each generation because of the original sort of sin of colonization. And these are things like landlessness and poverty and disease. And I mean, all these things, you know, losing your land in the 1850s completely, being put on a reservation, had huge effects on the tribes. When the settlers came in the valley at first in the 1840s, and began plowing in big ways in the Rich Prairie area. At first, the first peoples were not that many. And so it was no big deal. Tribes would say, hey, come on in and settle near us. You guys look rich. We want to be close to that rich stuff you have, and we want to learn what you have. But after, in time, as you know, every year the Oregon Trail expanded for a while there. We saw tens of thousands of people coming down by the 1850s. And by 1852, it was declared the whole valley was claimed by somebody, some white person. And farmers are not really happy at that time, at least probably not today as well, with people walking across their fence and walking across their land, taking a couple cattle here and there. They're not really happy with that. So, and they didn't realize, or maybe didn't care, that what they were doing when plowing fields is they're destroying the food source of the tribes. Plowing that field, which was maybe camas swale, would absolutely destroy all that camas in the area and all the other food plants on the prairie, turn that into a monocrop landscape. And then what are tribes supposed to eat? Fetch. Well, they have to move to another area, or they have to go hunting more, or they have to go fishing more. Things that settlers actually like to do as well. They like to hunt and fish. So we start to see, with tens of thousands of Americans coming in, taking all this land, turning it into something else that is not, the tribes are not allowed to collect from, right? Not allowed to eat from. And then hunting and fishing as well, we start to see their food sources, the tribes, disappear. And then by the 1850s, they are being talked about. The Kalapuyans, the Malala people, other people in the valley being talked about as vagrants and thieves. And you wonder why that happened, because they were being pushed off their land. They're being pushed into places nobody want to live, like river draws and stuff where it was all wet. They were on the outskirts of the main prairies. Allowed to stay there because they were somewhat useful for doing a little bit of work around the farm, but not really useful enough that we wanted you to stay on the farm and actually pay and feed you all the time. So, so while those tribal people in the valley helped a lot of the farmers build their farms, once that farm is built, and there's enough white people in the area to do the work, we don't need you anymore. You become a vagrant. You become somebody we don't want around, because you're gonna take, eventually you're gonna steal from us, take cattle, take horses or whatever, because you're looking for food. So at that point, there were a lot of editorials appearing in, or a few editorials appearing in newspapers, like in Salem here. And they were saying, well, we need to deal with this Indian problem. And one of the ways to deal with it is through extermination. Exterminate the natives. That will handle the problem. This is similar language they were using for wolves and any other kind of vermin they didn't like. So federal government wasn't willing to go that far. They had a few people that had morals and ethics working for them, and so they decided to instead move them onto reservations. And therein becomes your treaty policy, finally the sale of land, and then removal of reservations. And then the separation of the white populations from the Indian populations, with forts in between, so that nobody could interact if they never didn't want to happen. So that's all out of this notion of losing your land, losing your environment, the environment being changed so that you don't have any food left. So that becomes, at some level, an environmental destruction on the view of the tribes. A new philosophy comes in: the only useful land is land that's put in agriculture or for livestock. So we'll talk more about that later when we do other stuff. So when they got to the reservation, they were promised a lot of things through treaties, the ratified treaties, money, supplies, land, housing, food, things like that. Called sanitation or healthcare. What they did actually got was very much less than that. And it was very slow to get to the reservation. The distances, I don't think you knew the distances in Oregon. How far would people have that travel to get food from the valley to the reservations? And the fact that those trails, literally they were trails back in the day that had expanded to be wagon roads, were really impassable sometimes of the year, like in the wintertime. The crazy sort of like clay mud in Oregon just made, getting to Siletz, for example, impossible in the winter. And there was really no good route by sea. So they were unapproachable at some times of the year. Say they ran Ronde, I mean, while they had better roads, they still had a really tough time getting food there, and the distance were so far that the food budgets that were laid out in the treaties for annual budgets will be sort of exhausted in large part by the transportation costs by Teamsters to the reservations. Which they didn't realize it'd be so far, and the money came from DC very late sometimes. That all had to be voted on with Congress, and so when Congress held off on voting or disagreed with something, that would take another couple of months to happen. The checks had to be sent from Washington DC to San Francisco to the Wells Fargo office there. But the agent here had to send somebody down to San Francisco by schooner to get that money to bring it back to Oregon. So you see that's not a really efficient system at all. And so a lot of times agents would, like Joel Palmer, who was superintendent for a while, he actually would work a lot on credit, would get supplies from farmers and local store owners credit. And when he resigned, there were years afterwards, they were going after him for to justify his I think he wrote a bunch of invoices for credit for a bunch of people that were asking for payment. So he had to justify all that stuff later. They did it all because he had no money. He had something like 4,000 people, native people he was trying to feed at the reservation, and he had no money. So we can do it. So eventually the government had to say, well, we don't have enough money to feed you all the way, so we're gonna let you go back and gather foods like you normally would while you're on the reservation. So a lot of people at Grand Ronde would go into the Coast Range and they would forage for food there. Not allowed to do with guns, because when they move to the reservation, they're not allowed to have guns. Under the assumption they're gonna have to somehow leave the reservation and attack the white settlements in the valley. So eventually they had to open up a fishery on the Sound River, the Chesley River, owned by the city. And Grand Ronde people were going over there and getting salmon and bringing it back to the reservation. But as you can see, it was not a very efficient system at all. Land didn't actually come to the reservation for some 17 years. They were given, I think, about half acre in the first 10 years for each person to work, and so they didn't actually get land until about 1872 or 3, and then it took another 5 or more years to get all the equipment to actually manage the land appropriately for agriculture. And then their land at the reservation, as you probably know, is clay. It's literally really super dense clay. You can really see it if you go to the powwows in the summertime. You go off the nicely tended grass area they've created there. There's giant chunks of clay, this big, literally. And so that's the majority of the valley. And so they are expected to grow half of their food in clay. And they didn't have the right equipment, they didn't have seed. There was a number of transcribed statements from them in the 1860s that talk about these problems. Didn't have seed, and I have some of that in the book, so you can see what they're saying about their environment, what they're given on. All right, so I'm not gonna read all this stuff for you, going over some other stuff, so I don't hold myself by saying the same thing every time. Okay, so a lot of people adopted a new system of leaving the reservation because they couldn't make any money on the reservation. There were 6 jobs, and if the native person did the same job as the white person next door doing a job on the reservation, they could have to pay. So there wasn't really good opportunities to make any money on the reservation. So people adopted the system of leaving the reservation and then going into the valley here in Salem. People from Grand Ronde, they were mostly Salem, Independence, Wheaton Ferry area, and sort of camping out at the farms, helping harvest the crops there. And there's talk mainly about beans, berries, black walnuts, I think, and hops was big. Hops became huge in the late 18th century, well into the 20th century, until the hop blight hit. But Native people were really the primary indigenous farm laborers, and they were a huge population from all the reservations were there. We had Warren Springs people, Grand Ronde, Siletz, we even had Clown people coming over the hill, working in the valley. And I've even seen accounts of people coming from Arizona to work in the fields here too, because we had so many fields. So there was a lot here going on, and they had at the farms, they would have separate neighborhoods where they were camped, sometimes in these like lean-to situations. And there would be like Indian populations here, they would have poor whites here, they would have blacks over here, they would have them all separate. Some of the farms did really good. They would actually host movie nights, and they would have dances, and they would have ice cream for kids, just to keep everybody kind of happy, not fighting with each other at night, because they had worked all day long. And so yeah, so those things were happening. But they really literally became a new system where they would go into the valley, work in the summertime, coming back, and then maybe harvest off their land. If they had some land, usually use some hay or oats or something like that off their land. So that became a system that went on for literally 100 years. Really went on into the 1940s at least. As a pretty common until the Bracero movement, the Bracero Act was passed. They brought in Mexican farm laborers who would actually work for less money than Native people. So there you go. And then we see it sort of disappear after that. So Chief said at the Grand Ronde reservation were not shy about saying what they thought. That's their kind of their job. They actually in 1870s were brought to a meeting here at the First Methodist Church in Salem. They and all the other tribal leaders came there to be lectured to by Indian regents and missionaries of the Methodist Church. The chiefs of the reservation pushed back for those words. They had been taught to drink by whites, and everyone seemed drinking and gambling anyway, so why stop? They wanted equal treatment. They explained how poor everything was on the reservation. They had no resources. The promises of land sales and treating equal did not work. They were still poor while the whites got rich. They revealed that white Indian agents were not following laws. The United States was not appropriately following their agreements in the treaties of giving allotments and funding for the needs of the reservation. So while they're being lectured to live a moral life, they were saying, why should people you have here are not actually living moral life, so why should you actually change? I mean, things were actually changing. A lot of kids are going to the boarding schools, they're being assimilated, and every generation had less and less sort of tribalism about what they were doing. You want to use that word for them, but yeah, but they're being a little bit resistant to being lectured to by the whites. And then in 1872, Chief Louis Nipissing, he was one of the Marysville chiefs. And then chiefs of the reservation signed a petition sent to the president, Ulysses S. Grant. I have now been on the reservation 16 years, during that time I've seen poor white men come here as officers of it and stay a few years and go away rich, while I and all people have always been going poor. We at first had a great deal of money and came here in agreement to the terms of our treaty. My people have never got much benefit from that money. Our superintendents and agents have got all of it, while I have seen the people die for the want of food, so their horses die in winter when they have nothing to eat. The men you have sent here for officers have not only stolen our money, but have violated women and scattered diseases among us, which have reduced our numbers from thousands to hundreds. So when the reservation was first settled in 1856, there was about 1,200 people that remained at Grand Ronde. The rest went over to the Sluts Agency Coast Reservation. At 1900, there was 400 people left. Many of them died or left the reservation because it was a horrible place to live. If those people that could pass or maybe white, they would leave at times and just move in Portland. They would get jobs. They would stop identifying as native. Many of them stopped using their native language. Many of them stopped teaching their kids about their culture and ways. And when I was the head of culture at Grand Ronde, I had many families come to me who some of them would just enroll in the tribe. They were saying they didn't know anything about their culture or their language or their family. And they had just by chance had found the records to go enroll, but they said their grandparents had destroyed records, had destroyed any kind of records of who they were. So, and never taught them the language, so they would never go through the racism they experienced in society. And so this is the kind of experiences I was hearing. It's kind of supported by some of these statements by the tribes of chiefs. So that's most of the book here for you. Let me, so I've been talking a good long while. Let me move forward into my next part of the presentation. And this one maybe directly looks at the environment, the original environments of the tribes, and I call it reconstructing traditional indigenous environments in the Lehigh Valley. You know, in our lifetimes, nobody here is 180 years old, so in our lifetimes, we've never seen what the valley was originally like. And there's not really good studies of it either. I don't find many environmental histories of the valley. Those that are out there, sometimes only go back to the 1960s. And so that's not necessarily the original environmental history of the valley. So I've been looking for these things, looking for references to what the original environment of the valley was. I've been able to reconstruct stuff from journals and accounts and things. And other studies I've done, I kind of realized, hey, that relates a lot to this notion of being the original environment. And I think that for me, this subject is important because as I've been working with various organizations in Oregon, people have come to me from like people that want to do Oak Savanna, or people who want to restore a Camp's Prairie, or people that want to just do restoration generally. And they really truly want to do something good and as an environmental way and restore the environment. And I asked them, do you know what the environment was like before? And no people will ever say, yes, we know exactly what the environment was like before. Because that really hasn't been well researched. We don't really remember or understand how different it was. And I'm going to show you a little bit of how different it was here. So here is a view from Peterson Butte. These happen to be a really nice place to see much of the valley, and so it's all of it. Much of it from the Butte is really just dry, arid farmland. Maybe great if you're a farmer, but if you want to do any kind of restoration work or traditional environment, what do you do? I mean, how do you use this piece of land? If anybody were to turn this back into a traditional landscape. And in fact, if you start looking at the numbers, about 1% of our valley today is native landscape. The rest of it's all farmland or cities or roads. I got a picture from some files of what the valley looked like before they put all the dams in. This is the Sandiam River in a flood time, and see all the nice swailing water that came down. This is the kind of stuff that was changed with the Ronde Valley project, where they put dams in, and there was millions of dollars were spent on damming up the rivers and doing things like ditching and drain tiling in the valley. And we still do much of that stuff today. We still do drain tiling in the valley. So it's very different from today. I did a little bit of research years ago, 2021, on a place I thought was significant, Lake Labish. You've heard of it? It's pretty close to here. I think there's a Labish farmer in the audience. So Lake Labish, I mean, I've been living in Salem most of my life. And when I was a teenager, I think I was 17, I got a job in the summertime, reading onions at Lake Labish. And so I get on my bike and ride down Corden, and then 45 minutes later I was at the field. And then I would do this at like 7 o'clock in the morning. And I guess it was too early for me because after about a week I got pneumonia and I had to stop. And I was very upset about that. But you can imagine a teenager loving that kind of job in the morning. But, so I got really interested in doing this research on Lake Labish, and like, it has never been a lake in my life. I've never seen a lake there. There's almost no water there, right? I see a lot of ditching and stuff, but there's no water. There is a Labish Creek that runs through Kaiser, but that's actually apparently a ditch. Originally was a ditch that was built by this guy. He's got these brothers called the Hayes brothers that came into Lake Labish in around, was it 1915 or so? And they got attracted to the area. And I think the farmers at Lake Labish actually attracted them there because they had money. And they're looking for an opportunity for investment. So they bought 1,000 acres in Lake Labish. And at that time, they bought the wasted land. And this is these swales, and the lake itself is called wasted land because that's the land you don't want to farm. That's the land that would drown your crops every year if you did farming. So what they did is they bought that land at $1 an acre. What is land prices now? Like,
I don't know, it's not $1.
it's way more. Okay, so they spent 2 years digging a ditch with a ditch witch all the way to the Willamette River. That's Labish Creek. In around 1918, they completed that job. The farmers in the area also built ditches like the Jones ditch and everything into that ditch. And then other drain tiling came into the land. So not too long after that, they had pretty well drained the lake. And I think I've been doing more research on that because I want to do more with that project. And apparently there was pump station put in and a dam put in by the 1960s. So by the 1960s, it was finally fully hand water. And so the records of this lake were pretty interesting because this is actually a really hugely long lake, north of Salem. The Shmala village was likely up there somewhere. That this place is named after, or actually Chemeketa village is up there, this place is named after. Tribal village, sorry, Tribal up there, Chemeketa over here, it's right. So, so there were native people in the area that utilized, that likely accessed this lake for food. We do know from Malad, ethnographic accounts that they actually would come up to the lake, they had a name for it. And they would collect wapto here. So wapto was the endemic part of the lake. We also know from the settlers, statements in the newspaper, because they were interviewed at times and had statements in the Statesman Journal, what's now the Statesman Journal today, that the lake would flood. They were very upset about that. So all these farmers in the 1890s or so were saying, I want to use this nice, dark peat soil, but every time I go into the lake bed, it floods and it destroys my crops. And I'm not very happy about that, so let's do something about that. And so, and they were saying there were thousands of different kinds of birds and animals and plants there, and it was just wasted land. We wanted to destroy that because the problem is, for me, one of the problems is, besides this destruction of this landscape, is well, there were actually laws on the books at that time that protected lakes. You couldn't destroy a lake because they were becoming a sort of a rare feature of the landscape. But certain times of the year, like midsummer, this looked more like a swamp. So you can destroy swamps, and the farmers didn't really care, so they looked the other way. So the Hayes brothers, with the farmers helping them, eventually drained off this whole area and destroyed it. Control the water. One of the brothers, at least, if not both, took some of their profits from selling the land at a really premium price at the back. And they built a neighborhood. Where's the neighborhood? Hayesville, we're in it, right? This is part of it right here. The other one went up to another. Let me show you a picture before we get there. So here is Lake Labish. You've probably seen this from the highway. You got your house right there? That's funny. So, and here's, okay, this last winter, so I was contacted by a farmer in the lake, a couple years ago after he saw my article online about the history of the place, how it was destroyed. And he said, well, he started a conservation project about 20 years ago, 24 years ago now. And he put a lot of time into that, for 70 acres, and then he created this. He created this nice sort of native landscape, in creating it, and this winter, we saw enough rainfall that a lake developed. So pictures about what it may look like if it was actually a lake any time of year. Then we have this, picture, obviously, of Mount Hood in the background, so you have to have any kind of slideshow or So he said that he had 4 patches of this Wapato growing on his property. He didn't plant it. It just came back. So I think there's some memory in the soil, there's some seeds, probably seed bank in the soil that came back. He thinks that maybe it came from bees. We're not gonna win that argument, but I've gone back now every year for the last couple of years, checking it out, seeing the progress of restoration there. He's doing a pretty good job, and we've replanted this canvas back there. We're trying to spread canvas around more. There's way too much like willow out there. He's always destroying it as much as he can. But this Wapato has gotten to the point where when the lake came in, I think it spread a lot of seeds around. So everywhere you go in that lake bed now, there's Wapato growth. So I think in 5 years, it'll be just flat Wapato all across the lake bed, which is pretty cool. There's also tule there, there's also cattail there, there's also a lot of jungus there, so lots of native plants there that we can actually, at some point, go start harvesting on a regular basis, Wapato, tule, canvas, for all kinds of different projects and food buildings. So here's Wapato about a month ago, when it kind of begins to die off, the energy of the plant goes into the bulb. The bulb that's harvested then is super nutritious. It's called Indian potato back in the day. And it was a substitute for potatoes, and actually settlers liked it. There's actually lots of different kinds of this certain urban plant around the world. Hawaii has versions of it. Asia, Latin America, South America, all around the world, there's different versions of this plant for all kinds of products. Sometimes they're on the store today. I've actually seen Wapato for sale in local Asian grocery stores. At Market and Lancaster. And they didn't label Wapato, they just had this like 7 bowls inside of a strip wrap package for $7. It was like pretty cool to see. They didn't know it was stuff. So that's pretty cool. So further research that same month, a couple years ago, I also went into the origins of Wapato Lake, trying to figure out why it also was drained, because I know it was drained. We have a lot more cultural information about that lake. We know that the Tualatin people wanted it for their treaty, with their treaty for their reservations. We see that sort of drawing up there by Gibbs and Starling. That's where exactly they wanted the reservation to be in 1851. It was a really significant place to them. They knew there was a lot of food there, so they wanted to keep it. We also know that Wapato is pretty good food for ducks. It has a really good environment for ducks and geese. And there are records in newspapers in this area about the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of ducks that would stop this lake every year. So many so that apparently sportsmen in Portland got wind of this and they began coming to the lake every year, setting up their duck blinds around the lake and shooting ducks in the lake every year. Farmers were okay with that, but not so happy because many of those sportsmen would just leave the dead ducks in the lake. Which was not necessarily best for ducks, that for people. So, one of the Hayes brothers, at least from the Labish project, took his winnings, came to this area and bought another 800 acres here. Did the same thing, worked with other farmers to dig a trench all the way to the north, to the Tualatin River, and by 1935, had drained off Wapato Lake. Now, I've gone back in geo maps, found, some maps of the lake, some of the origins of the lake, also found these yellow areas that go into the foothills that appear to be giant swales, kind of wetlands that probably expand when there's a lot of moisture in the area. So it's much larger than just the lake itself. The farmers in the area, just to bring everything up to the current history, really got tired of having to sort of manage that the drainage every year. Apparently it was pretty expensive and began selling it back to the federal government in like 1980s and 90s. And then through the 12 National Wildlife Refuge, they were assembling all their various land parts, the puzzle, to the point where I think it was last year, they opened up Wapato Lake National Wildlife Refuge again. You can go walk through there, they have a trail. There's not much water yet, but they are trying to destroy the drain fielding and the ditching so the water comes back and it stays there. The Ronde Tribal working with them to replant water back in lakes. They're hoping to remake the lake into a waterfowl flyover zone. Again, so there is a chance there as well. I'd like you to go back and see how they've been doing with the replanting of Wapato to see how well it's coming back. I assume that's gonna, again, in a few years, sort of start steamrolling. We're gonna see a lot more Wapato in the area than there is today. So this kind of relates to a lot of stuff. I'm like, wow, these wetlands are pretty significant. They're for the culture of the tribes. Is there further evidence of wetlands in the area? Well, go back to the geo maps, and they're all really available online, which you got yourself. Here's one for wet canvas prairie at Brickville, just above Brickville. Kind of where Basket Slough is, not too far from here, right? So that's one. The Central Valley has Lake Labish. We have this Quasan Lake over by Mount Angel. We have a miry swamp or slough over by Woodburn. Over in the Tualatin Valley, we have these giant wetlands that come out of the Coast Range. one of which is still a wetland park, the Killen Wetlands Feature Park. But this is a huge characteristic of the landscape that not many people talk about anymore. So this is everywhere. I'm just talking about the best ones. So, and then down south of Eugene and Springfield, there's this giant camas whale, like giant. It almost fills the whole GLO map. It goes into the next one above it. So, and there's still a road sign on I-5 that says camas whale. And they have oral history from settlers about seeing Native people harvesting camas at soil. So we have a lot of information suggesting that all throughout the valley, we have these swaly, ponding, wetland areas. And I'm wondering if there's more evidence to see how I go. So we do have some Wilkes expeditionary notes from journals that were really never accessed by Wilkes, I think. But the scientists that were on the expedition that came down through the valley were collecting daily notes in their journals about what they were experiencing. On September 10th, in both journals from Eld and Emmons here, they talk about this giant wetland they call Lake Labish, 80 feet in width and 3/4 of a mile in length and about a foot deep. So that's a huge thing down by the Longtom River. And this happened a couple days after there had been what they call a freshet, which was summer rain valley. I've been doing my own studies at Minto Brown Park. Minto was, as you know, was a farmer here well before a lot of the people farmers here developed things like, sheep in this area, and was on the regional board for the state fair, all that stuff. So John Minto had a huge farm that was on the island there. This is what we call a farm field here. Lots of junkets here, as you see, and lots of camas as well. I go back and visit every year just to see how it's doing. And one year, 2022, in May, we had a lot of moisture in May, and this would develop after every rainfall. This is the ponding, this is the swaling that we're talking about back in 1841 and later even today. So Minto clearly was a farmer before there were drain tiling, they were really ditching. So he probably had to contend with this in his own lifetime. But he didn't actually destroy the ponding action. I've been doing some reading about what causes ponding in the valley. And apparently, Mount Mazama, when it exploded, dumped a bunch of ash in the valley. That ash has deteriorated to become a clay. So we have a clay layer in the valley. That clay layer, some 7,000 years ago or so, has created this new kind of environment with ponding and swaling in the valley. So unless that has been destroyed by drain tiling stuff, it sort of maintains it, continues to pond. But many of the landscapes nowadays have destroyed that clay layer. A couple days later, the pond disappears because it eventually drains away into the local water source. So native plants do fine, ag crops probably don't do so fine. And then this is kind of interrelated with other projects we're working on in terms of like cultural fires. And you've probably heard of this before. People are thinking about restarting cultural fires in many areas because maybe forest policy hasn't really been that helpful for staff, or has been helpful for fire, but not really for managing fire. So back in 1841 again, the Wilkes expedition guys, Scott Emmons and Dana, they're recording they're walking through the Willamette Valley in August, September, and everything around it is burnt. The whole valley, the prairies are all burnt, except for the green patches of woods and narrow belts bordering upon streams. So this gives us an idea what the characteristic of a fire is in an area that they're constantly burning every year. It doesn't burn down everything. It only burns the dry patches in the prairies where the grasses died, where there's still a little bit of fuel. It doesn't burn into the areas that are wet, the areas by the streams. There had been Again, another one of those freshets a few days before this, so it had wetted or a lot of moisture into these like patches by the streams. Incidentally, that's also where I believe their horses went. They had horses, they were walking, but they had horses with them on this expedition. And the horses would take off in the middle of the night. But for whatever reason, they were not hobbling them, so they just took off and they had to send a scout after to find them. And it would take a day or half a day to find these horses every time. And so in the meantime, they have to walk slowly south. And the horses likely were looking for food. There was nothing to eat on that bird prairie, so they're going off into these green patches to find food as best they can. So that's a kind of ironic little symptom of what's going on here. But you notice that these events are happening simultaneously with the ponding action. So what's going on there? So I think our valley is a little bit unique. According to other valleys, maybe California is different. We did have Kalapuya set fire on a regular basis every year in the prairies. And we're working on experience with that, but we also had ponding years. And so there's got to be some sort of a formula here on water and fire together in the valley. Does the water then preserve species of underground, in the water, lowlands, the prairies, or help with that? That clearly would mitigate fire, the advance of the fires, and they're setting in the same season. So we have this kind of a unique thing going on here. Are there species that are preserved because of the water that would not be preserved in places like Northern California? I don't know, because nobody's really investigated in a great detailed way before. But we need to look at that. I think that if we're going to do restoration, and cultural fire is talked about a lot in terms of restoration projects, right? Where's the water? We need to bring water back too. We need to allow water to remain, because I think that 120 odd years ago, people made the enemy of water. They said water was bad for this environment. Let's get rid of it. Let's manage it. Overmanage. Just like it was fire, they said you can't just set fire willy-nilly on the landscape. You have to stop doing that. So I think we need to return both of them. We're going to actually do any kind of environmental restoration. Stop to not. I'm kind of done. You want to see my last slide? We talked too much. Yeah, I'm kind of done, so we're good. Thanks.
I read Brady's Sweetgrass. Yeah, by Robert, and she was talking about how early settlers would critique the indigenous people and how they were growing things, the single crop. All the crops had to be one variety or whatever. But they were used to, what she calls the three sisters, where they had corn, beans, and squash growing together, and that they were getting higher yields off their crops, than the settlers were. It was just interesting to hear stuff like that.
Yeah, it's important to make sure people understand it's not in Oregon. We didn't have corn, beans, or squash in Oregon. With anybody ate. There may have been corn. I think there was the suggestion that maybe there was some corn traded from the plains or something, or not corn, but actually corn husks, because there was a suggestion that people on the Columbia were breeding corn husks as another graft, but we didn't have that here.
Well, I'm mostly going by the fact that they, the white people were trying to tell the natives,
Right.
You're not doing it right.
Right.
Our way is better, but evidently, they're natives.
Yeah, there is that sense of superiority that all the people have to deal with. Absolutely, you're not doing it right. You're wasting the land. You're wasting the space. You should be using it appropriately. That's just the notion of wasted land, wasted. If people are not completely putting everything into production, then you're wasting it. So, yeah.
I have a question. I'm curious. When I lived in New Mexico, I saw a lot of resurgence of native language, doing apps and doing courses and things like that. I was curious if there was something like that or development of that in Oregon.
Yeah, so the tribes are actually working on languages and have language nesting and net language, schools, immersion schools. In fact, I think Grand Ronde has one of the most successful in the nation. They've gotten continuous, I think, 25 to 30 years of funding for that from the federal government through any grants, and they have produced a number of people that can actually speak the language now. So yeah, it's absolutely a project tribes here.
On a similar note, so at the Soil and Water Conservation District, I've been looking into potentially including, native names for plants, the native plants, as well as the Latin and the common names.
Yeah, that's been something that we've began to get into. I think I've been working on an essay for this, one of these native plants books that are coming out. And we're suggesting, I think a lot of botanists and stuff are suggesting that we start adding a native name in there too. And we're starting to create word lists in different languages, because part of the problem is sometimes people generalize native. And we're saying which native this and that, which tribe is that you're talking about. So in this area, we have potentially 60 different languages. So what language are you actually going to use? So I would prefer people in the Willamette Valley to use mostly Kalapuyan. We have a good number of a good part of the language preserved. So you probably could use Kalapuyan. People of the Grand Ronde tribe, because they're working mostly with Chinook-Wawa, which is also a language that's spoken in the valley here. I usually advocate for that. But that's not the original language of this land. It's simply the language they use in addition to Kalapuyan. So I still advocate for Kalapuyan here and as much as possible. But in a pinch, you can always use Chinook-Wawa too. So yeah, so that's important to say. Wherever area you're in, if you're in the Rogue River Basin, I would use Takelma. If you're in the Umpqua Basin, you have 5 languages to choose from. If you were, see what I'm saying? So,
Do you have any suggestions for where to find that information?
well, yes.
I'm trying to do Google searches and it.
How long do you No, you have to go to cultural experts to know that stuff, and they'll go to. Like the handbooks of North American Indians are pretty good in terms of showing where people live and stuff. There are some maps out there. Some are accurate, some are not. I would suggest using all the maps. I would get some feedback on which ones are accurate and which are not first. So yeah.
I was actually thinking more on the name side of things, like finding the Kalapuya names for a lot of our native.
Yeah, we have cultural experts at Grand Ronde. You can ask them, you can always ask me. We have one linguist in the area, 2 linguists that work with Kalapuyan, they can ask them. We did produce a dictionary. It's the problem with the dictionary that was produced by somebody who's not a linguist. And regardless of what we told him, he had the dictionary published after his death. And he didn't reference anything in the dictionary. So we don't know exactly where he got all the words. So they are probably around 70% correct. We just don't know. So, he made a lot of mistakes and left a lot of stuff out. Probably put his own interpretations of the things he should have done. So while we do have the dictionaries, they're not really useful. You really have to get that. If you go to one of the dictionaries, you find one and use it, and you really get checked by Grand Ronde or somebody else. Yeah.
How might one research out the native vegetation on their land?
There's plenty of actually native, so ethnobotany books out there. There's a lot out there.
As far as the location in the valley, are there any?
Yeah, that's
The land grant?
that's a different question altogether. Again, there hasn't been really good histories written, environmental histories written about what things were people like before. So a lot of it is interpretation. We can go to places like GLO maps. And if you go on their field notes for the maps, you'll find pretty good descriptions of a few plants. They'll talk about like hazel, they'll talk about willow and poplar and oak sometimes and maple. They don't really get into great, you don't see great descriptions of a lot of like understory plants. Just trees and stuff. So, but from that description, you can get an idea of what could be the understory based on other research. Yeah. But there are botany books out there that you can get and do research on. It takes a lot of work to interpret that. Yeah.
Is there anything, so the regular session is coming up? Is the Grand Ronde working with anybody, any senators or legislators on pushing a bill forward?
For
Anything that's of interest related to this?
I don't know. I'm not actually working at Grand Ronde. I'm just a member of the tribe. Occasionally they do let us know what's going on. But generally they don't. So, oh yeah, that happened. That's nice. So, sometimes you can do like searches in congressional sites online. You can look up Grand Ronde, you can figure out what they're advocating for. They will push bills forward.
So they do have like a public.
They do have advocates that, lawyers and stuff, and people get paid a lot of money working for them in DC, sure.
I'd be interested in finding.
Yeah, you can, I've done a little bit of work, like looking at, congressional websites, doing searches on bills. And you can see them sort of advocating for something or wanting something. I think in recent years, they've gotten some land back. Based on problematic surveys. At the tribe, we're constantly trying to fish. I think the next big thing is to fish for more fishing rights, hunting rights. Because when Grand Ronde was restored, there was kind of a racist atmosphere in Oregon. They didn't like restoration of tribes. And there was a lot of letters to the governor of Oregon saying, well, we don't want to support Grand Ronde getting hunting and fishing rights because that would prohibit fishing in Oregon. If that's even possible. So, so the only way that the governor or Indian senators would actually listen or introduce a bill is if Grand Ronde voluntarily gave hunting and fishing in the restoration bill. So they didn't lose it through termination, but they did lose it through restoration. So right now Grand Ronde the tactic is to go through the state itself and arrange agreements for the state, not treaties, but agreements with the state. To have rights for hunting and fishing in certain areas under those agreements.
Because I subscribe to a few email newsletters like Oregon Wild, and they often have like campaigns to make it easy to, wade ways, but people who have the power to make changes, in the legislature or whatever. And I kind of wish I had something like that. Or, Indian, so I can know.
Yeah, they have folks that are advocating for them. They hire, folks doing that work. I don't really know what they're involved because I'm not probably getting grants.
What are your areas of future research for your next book?
Well, I did a bunch of research this summer, like you saw a piece of it on here for the Lane County area. And actually, I'm getting called a lot for Eugene, Springfield, the McKenzie River area, and Oak Ridge area. So I'm getting a lot of information now for that Southern Valley into the Cascades and much more than I had earlier. Almost enough for a book. I think I produced a report of about 200 pages last year. And that's just raw reports. We can look at that in book form, but I think that I'm getting to the point where in a couple of years I'll have enough for another book for the Southern Valley. Because if you'll notice in the book, I don't go really deeply into the Southern Valley because we don't have much. It's been kind of a black hole down there. So, and now I'm getting more it's weird because, I've been reading through this material the last couple of years. For Eugene's, for Lake County, and I've had these reports from anthropologists and historians from like the 1970s. And they were saying there's nothing in the archives down there. And I'm finding a lot of stuff. So either they're bad historians or they just never went to the archives and looked. I don't know. Maybe that's part of what I was talking about early on when I was saying, well, there's much more available nowadays, and now they have electronic searching through records, and you can find more than you ever could before. Yeah.
I appreciate your topic of restoration of the wetland or the environment or ecosystems, however you want to phrase it, but who's out there? Are there people out there that are interested in that and working towards it?
Yeah, I mean, there's individuals and there's some organizations that look at that, like. I found a lot in the watershed organizations are doing a lot of work in their watersheds.
Okay.
Like Long Tom has kind of led the way in the valley in terms of how to do these things. They actually got money for cultural fire projects and things in the Southern Valley and trained a bunch of people on cultural fire. And so that money is gone now, so they're trying to do this stuff, but yeah, we've had some influence with the watershed organizations, and they've found people in that area on a long time that do things like Oak Savannah. They want to restore Oak Savannah. One of my comments about that is that Oak Savannah was tended in that way for a purpose. The purpose was food for acorns, right? So if you're not gonna eat the food, why do you want the Oak Savannah? See what I'm saying? It's more at that point it becomes a park or almost an outdoor museum of prettiness or beauty. And another thing is, there's, like I noticed over there in one of those state park guides, they were talking about like camas growing under like oak overstory. And I think that's a symptom of what today's culture likes. They like Oak Savannah. It's pretty, like to walk through it, like to camp under it, that kind of stuff. And so because of that, the Oak Savannahs then preserve also the understory, which is camas. So that's how that camas is becoming preserved under Oak Savannahs. Otherwise, everywhere else, unless it's a state park or somebody's doing it intentionally on the land, camas is gone. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sort of answering her question a little bit, we have a CREP program on our farm on Butte Creek. It's one of the many programs that the government makes available to help landowners with resources to do restoration. And I wanted to attend your talk because I'm very aware that only the Malala tribe lived on our farm, or at least they used parts of it for hunting. And I'm just interested in the tribal perspective of how we approach our conservation efforts.
Yeah.
In preserving this creek land.
Yeah, I think as I do more of these talks, people get more and more interested in these things. And I think that's a valid interest. I've been thinking in the last few years about, what would it be like if native traditional ecological knowledge was as respected as any other knowledge in the world, where would we be today if that wasn't just discounted 100 years ago? It would be integrated into how we think about the land, perhaps how we feel about the land, how we philosophize about the land. We would be more related to the land than we are today. So, a lot of people are getting interested in that. To move on to your question, going to the tribe is one way to perhaps get help for that.
Okay.
The problem is the tribe is only one tribe, and there's now a million people asking them for the same thing. So the tribes really work on a basis of then what's the greatest benefit for us? Because we're going to spend effort on that, we're going to spend money on that. Is it going to benefit us all? And so generally they won't respond. So somehow there's a benefit to them. Sometimes they respond to cities because there's a political benefit there, sometimes they'll respond to other areas if there's some other kind of benefit, archaeological or something. So that's the big problem right now. I hear almost daily now, people saying, well, I tried to contact Grand Ron, nobody answered. Well, there's like 12 people there. And there's, several million people have already done one answer. So it's just that they don't have enough people. Get with other organizations, get with watershed organizations, get with other environment minded organizations, and then try to work with the tribes. Try to integrate, bring in, work to bring in native people that are now being trained in these things into your boards, into your organization, to help sort of direct your actions.